The wind did not just blow across the high plains of the Montana Territory. It screamed, a high, thin sound like a dying animal caught in the throat of the canyon. Snow, dry as bone dust and just as white, swirled in blinding sheets, erasing the line where the iron-gray earth met the leaden sky. In the heart of this frozen void stood a cabin, its timber walls groaning under the weight of the drifts, looking less like a home and more like a tombstone for the living. Inside, the air tasted of pine resin and old regrets. Thomas sat by the hearth, the orange glow of the embers carving deep, jagged shadows into the map of his face. He was a man built of hard angles and silence, his hands scarred by a lifetime of things he tried to forget. He watched the fire as if it held a confession, his mind drifting back to the smoke of a war that had never truly ended for him. He had come to this wilderness to be alone, to let the cold numb the parts of his soul that still burned with the memory of blood on his hands. He was a ghost inhabiting a body of muscle and bone, waiting for the winter to finally claim what was left. The silence was his only companion, heavy and absolute, until the scratching started at the heavy oak door. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the frantic clawing of a starving wolf or the rhythmic thud of a loose branch. But then came the voice, a fragile, trembling thread of sound that pierced through the roar of the gale. "Please," the voice gasped in a tongue that sounded like breaking glass and silk, followed by a desperate plea in broken English. "Please, do not hurt me. I cannot walk." Thomas did not move at first, his instinct for isolation warring with a dormant spark of humanity. He reached for the heavy iron poker, his knuckles whitening. He had learned long ago that mercy in this land was often a precursor to a shallow grave. Yet the sound came again, a sob so raw it seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He stood, his joints popping like dry kindling, and threw back the bolt. The door flew open, admitting a swirl of ice and a small, crumpled shape that collapsed onto the threshold. She looked like a bird with broken wings, a splash of dull gray against the blinding white of the snow. Her name was May, though he did not know it then. She was no more than 27, her face pale as parchment, framed by matted black hair that sparkled with frost. She wore a tattered prairie dress of coarse gray wool, soaked through and frozen stiff. As Thomas reached down to pull her inside, she recoiled, her dark eyes wide with a terror that went deeper than the fear of the storm. "Please," she whispered again, her breath coming in ragged plumes. "I can't walk. Don't hurt me." Thomas looked down and saw the reason. Her legs were wrapped in filthy, blood-stained bandages that had frozen to her skin, the fabric stiff with ice and old infections. He saw the way she dragged herself, her fingers raw and bleeding from clawing at the frozen earth. He didn't speak. He couldn't find the words that wouldn't sound like a threat. Instead, he hooked his large, calloused hands under her arms and hauled her toward the heat of the fire. She whimpered, a low, guttural sound of agony, but she did not fight him. He laid her on a pallet of furs near the hearth, the warmth of the cabin beginning to melt the ice on her lashes. He watched her for a long moment, a woman who had clearly traveled miles on her hands and knees through a hell of ice. "Who did this to you?" he finally asked, his voice a low rumble that hadn't been used in weeks. May did not answer immediately. She watched him with the wary gaze of a trapped doe, her body shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together. "Men," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the wood. "Bad men. They took the wagons. They left me to the cold because I was slow." Thomas felt a familiar cold stone settle in his gut. He knew the breed of men she spoke of, the vultures who followed the trails, preying on the weak and the discarded. He looked at her ruined legs and then back at the door, where the storm continued to howl, a reminder that out there the world was indifferent to whether they lived or died. The task of tending to her was a grim, methodical process that required a delicacy Thomas feared he no longer possessed. He fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, kneeling beside her with a heaviness in his chest. As he began to peel away the frozen bandages, the smell of gangrene and neglect filled the small room. May bit her lip until it bled, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the furs. "You have to stay still," Thomas murmured, his tone more a command than a request. "If the rot takes the bone, there is nothing I can do." He worked with a grim focus, his large fingers surprisingly steady as he cleaned the jagged lacerations that crisscrossed her shins. They weren't just wounds from the trail. They were the marks of shackles, deep and cruel. She watched him, her fear slowly giving way to a profound, exhausted bewilderment. "Why you help?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am nothing to you." Thomas paused, a piece of bloodied cloth in his hand. He looked at the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Maybe I'm tired of watching things die," he said, the honesty of it surprising even him. He applied a poultice of crushed herbs and clean tallow, wrapping her legs in fresh strips of linen he had cut from his own spare shirts. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You'll stay here until the spring thaw," he said. "The pass is closed. Even a man with 2 good legs wouldn't survive a mile out there." May looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a lie, for the hidden cruelty she had come to expect from men. She found only a weary, jagged kind of honor. "Thank you," she whispered, the words heavy with a weight that transcended language. Thomas merely nodded and stood up, returning to his chair by the fire. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the quiet of a shared sanctuary. As the weeks bled into a singular white blur of winter, the cabin became a world unto itself. Thomas spent his days hauling wood and checking the snares he set near the frozen creek, while May sat by the fire, her strength returning in slow, painful increments. She was a creature of quiet resilience, her presence changing the very air of the cabin. She began to mend his worn clothes with a needle carved from bone, her fingers moving with a grace that spoke of a life before the gray dress and the shackles. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew comfortable, a bridge built of shared survival. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters like a ghost demanding entry, May looked up from her work. "You have a heavy heart, Thomas," she said, her English improving with each passing day. "It is louder than the storm." Thomas stopped sharpening his knife, the rasp of the stone falling silent. "We all have ghosts, May. Some just howl louder than others." He thought of the town he had left behind, the faces of those he couldn't save, and the man he used to be before the world broke him. May reached out, her hand hovering near his scarred forearm before she pulled it back. "My father said that a man who carries the world on his back will eventually be crushed by it. You must put it down, or you will break." Thomas looked at her, seeing the wisdom in her eyes that had been forged in the same fires as his own. "And what about you?" he asked. "What do you carry?" May looked down at her bandaged legs. "I carry the shame of surviving when others did not," she said softly. "But I am learning that survival is not a sin. It is a debt we owe to the ones who didn't make it." The words hung in the air, a profound truth that seemed to settle the restless spirits in the room. The peace of the cabin was shattered on a morning when the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a blinding, cruel brilliance over the snow. Thomas was outside, clearing the path to the woodshed, when he heard the rhythmic crunch of many hooves on frozen crust. He stood still, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife at his belt. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses steaming in the cold air. They were clad in heavy furs, their faces hidden behind salt and pepper beards and the grime of the trail. At their head was a man with eyes like flint, a man Thomas recognized from the posters pinned to the saloon walls in the valley. Blackwood. He was a man who thrived on the chaos of the frontier, a predator who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned or broken. "We're looking for a piece of property," Blackwood called out, his voice a gravelly sneer. "A little bird in a gray dress. She flew the coop a few weeks back." Thomas didn't move, his body tensing like a coiled spring. "There's no one here but me," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. Blackwood laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Now, don't go lying to me, friend. We followed the blood trail as far as the drifts would let us. We know she's in there. Just hand her over, and we'll leave you to your lonesome. She's got a debt to pay, and I don't like being cheated." Thomas looked at the cabin door, knowing May was listening, knowing the terror that must be clawing at her throat. He looked back at Blackwood, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. "She doesn't owe you anything but the lead in your chest," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried further than a shout. The air between them turned electric, the rising action of the confrontation reaching a tipping point as the riders reached for their holsters. The war Thomas had tried to leave behind had finally found him, and this time he wasn't fighting for a cause or a flag. He was fighting for the soul of a woman who had taught him how to live again. The lead rider, a man whose soul seemed as charred as the ends of his cigar, spat into the snow, the dark liquid burning a hole in the white crust. "You're a long way from help, hermit," Blackwood sneered, his hand hovering over the grip of his pistol. "Is one broken girl worth the price of your life? We've tracked her across 3 territories. She's property, nothing more." Thomas didn't blink, the cold air filling his lungs like liquid iron. He felt the weight of his past, the ghosts of the men he'd killed and the ones he'd failed, all standing behind him in the bitter wind. "In this house, she is a guest," Thomas replied, his voice a low, vibrating cord of steel. "And you are a trespasser." The tension snapped like a frozen branch. One of the supporting riders, a younger man with a face twisted by a desperate, hungry cruelty, drew his weapon with a jagged cry. Thomas moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a predator that had spent years in the dark. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a remnant of a more violent age, a man who understood the geometry of a gunfight. Before the young man could level his barrel, Thomas had his own sidearm cleared. The crack of the shot rolled across the valley like a mountain falling. The young rider slumped forward, his blood a shocking, steaming crimson against the pristine snow. Blackwood roared, a sound of pure animal fury, and dived from his horse as the remaining men scrambled for cover behind the woodpile. The silence of the mountain was gone, replaced by the frantic, percussive rhythm of a life-or-death struggle. Inside the cabin, May pressed her back against the heavy timber wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear the lead thudding into the exterior logs, the vibrations rattling the very foundation of her sanctuary. She looked at her legs, still weak, still bound in Thomas's shirts, and felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, but a fierce, burning determination to survive. The gunfight was a slow, agonizing game of inches. Thomas crouched behind the stone well housing, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. He was outnumbered, but he had the terrain and the clarity of a man who had already accepted his own death. He watched the shadows of the woodpile, waiting for the flicker of movement that would betray the second gunman. "You can't hide forever," Blackwood screamed from behind a fallen spruce. "I'll burn you out. I'll watch that little bird scream while the roof falls in." The words were meant to provoke, to draw Thomas out into the open, but they only served to sharpen his focus. He saw a flash of a gray hat near the edge of the timber. Thomas fired, the recoil jarring his shoulder, and heard a choked gasp, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the frozen earth. Now it was just him and Blackwood. The antagonist was a man of systemic cruelty, a man who believed power was the only currency that mattered. He emerged from the trees, not with a gun, but with a torch he had managed to strike against a dry piece of flint, the orange flame licking at the freezing air. He threw it toward the cabin roof. The dry cedar shingles caught instantly, the fire hungry and bright. Thomas felt a cold dread wash over him. He couldn't stay behind the well and watch her burn. He stood up, exposing himself to the open air, his eyes locked on Blackwood. "Look at me!" Thomas shouted, his voice a command that stopped the world. Blackwood turned, a grin of triumph spreading across his weathered face, and raised his pistol. But Thomas was faster, his purpose fueled by a morality that Blackwood could never comprehend. 2 shots rang out in such quick succession they sounded like a single heartbeat. Blackwood stumbled, the light leaving his eyes as he collapsed into the snow he had sought to stain. Thomas didn't wait to see the man die. He turned and ran toward the cabin, the smoke already curling into the winter sky. The heat was intense, a physical wall that pushed back against him. He burst through the door, coughing as the gray haze filled the room. "May!" he shouted, his eyes stinging. He found her on the floor, dragging herself toward the door, her face set in a mask of agonizing effort. She hadn't waited for him to save her. She was fighting for herself. He scooped her up in his arms, her weight negligible against his adrenaline, and carried her out into the frigid air just as a portion of the roof buckled and groaned. They sat in the snow together, huddling for warmth as they watched the cabin, his sanctuary, her refuge, be consumed by the flames. The orange light cast long, flickering shadows across the valley, a second sunrise born of destruction. Thomas looked at his hands, blackened by soot and blood, and then at May. She was shivering, her eyes reflecting the fire, but she was alive. "I lost everything," Thomas whispered, the weight of his isolation finally breaking. May reached out, her small, calloused hand finding his. She squeezed his fingers with a strength that surprised him. "No," she said, her voice direct and innocent, yet filled with a profound truth. "You found the man you used to be. The house is just wood. We are the ones who remain." They sat there as the fire began to die down to embers, 2 broken figures in a vast, indifferent wilderness, bound together by a debt that could never be fully repaid. The next morning the world was silent again. The snow had begun to fall softly, covering the black scar of the cabin and the bodies of the men who had brought violence to the mountain. Thomas had salvaged what he could from the periphery of the fire, a few blankets, some dried meat, and a sturdy sled he used for hauling timber. He bundled May into the furs, her legs protected from the biting cold. They had a long journey ahead of them, down through the pass and toward the settlement in the valley, where a doctor could finally mend what was broken in her. As he gripped the ropes of the sled, Thomas looked back at the ruins of his life. He felt a strange sense of lightness, as if the fire had burned away the layers of guilt and bitterness he had worn like armor. He wasn't a recluse anymore. He was a protector. "Where will we go?" May asked, her voice small but steady. Thomas looked toward the horizon where the sun was struggling to pierce through the heavy gray clouds. "To a place where the wind doesn't scream so loud," he said. "To a place where you can learn to walk again." He began to pull, his boots crunching rhythmically in the deep powder. The physical exertion was a penance and a promise. He knew the road would be hard, that the law might come looking for the men he'd killed, and that the winter was far from over. But for the first time in years, he wasn't running away from something. He was moving toward something. The resolution of their journey was not marked by a grand celebration, but by the quiet, steady persistence of the human spirit. As they descended into the lower elevations, the air grew marginally warmer, and the sight of distant chimney smoke signaled the return to community. Thomas knew he would have to answer for the blood on the snow, but he also knew that he had allies now. diverse individuals in the town who had seen the cruelty of men like Blackwood and would stand by a man who chose justice over silence. He looked down at May, who had fallen into a light sleep, her face peaceful despite the ordeal. She was a symbol of resilience, a catalyst that had forced him to engage with the world again. He realized then that redemption wasn't a destination one reached, but a choice one made every single day. It was in the act of helping a stranger, in the refusal to be intimidated by corruption, and in the courage to believe in a future that hadn't been written yet. The Wild West was a harsh, unforgiving place, a landscape of wounds and scars, but as the first lights of the settlement flickered in the dusk, Thomas felt a spark of hope. It was a small thing, fragile as a candle flame in a gale, but it was enough. He kept walking, his silhouette a dark, determined shape against the white expanse, moving forward into a world that was still cold, still dangerous, but no longer empty. The story of the lone rancher and the woman who couldn't walk would become a legend in those parts, a testament to the idea that even in the heart of winter, the human heart can find a way to bloom.